Hey.
Hey.
Hello. Calling. Wow.
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
Shocking. And calling Rick Beyer in.
Yes.
London.
London.
Holy shit! That's really wow. It's cool.
Yeah. Hey. I think the real me is in Wiesbaden today.
And the real me is in Warsaw.
Wow. So this is just
get around.
These are our avatars.
That sounds so cool.
Because we're so cool. We have avatars.
Yeah.
Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Tours, historical tours, offering a variety of history tours in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. You can check it out at StephenAmbroseTours.com. That's exactly right. And whether you're watching live or watching on a replay or listening on the HHH podcast, thank you for joining us. And today we have an encore episode on the battle for the Scheldt Estuary. And this is our, you saw us a few weeks ago, live. We were live together.
Right, from London.
It's very exciting. And now we're trying to hold on to the mistake.
We had so much fun. We didn't want to break up the band and leave the studio.
We are in the spacious London studios, and yet another one of the sets in the London studios that people haven't seen yet.
Because they are so vast.
Yes, they are. Let us know what you're where you're calling from and what you're drinking. And I should mention, Chris, that we appreciate our Patreon patrons.
Very much.
We want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons who are all listed here. And there's 2 spaces.
Susan needs company. Susan has been down there all by herself for so long.
We need somebody. We need 2 more people to step up and be top shelf patrons. Right. And if you do that, you could get a hat.
Maybe.
You will get a hat if you want one, a History Happy Hour hat. And you can do it by going to patreon.com/History Happy Hour.
Indeed.
And so, Chris, I'm sure we have lots of people joining us, but because we are today on the Encore program, we don't really have a way of checking that all out, but we should take this down so they can see us again.
They sure you want to do that? You want to do that?
See that we're together, and we're hanging out. And tell us a little bit about your Warsaw tour, since I know that people can't take it this year, but they can take it next year.
Yeah, well, starting in Gdansk, where the first shots of the war are fired, and from Gdansk, all the highlights and lowlights in Poland, and then Krakow, Warsaw, Auschwitz.
Wow.
Cool things like the Great Escape site.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Then finish up in Berlin.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. But where you're?
I'm on the Ghost Army tour. This is the first time we've done it in 5 years.
Do you remember where everything is?
Barely. I mean, I think if you checked in with the real me now, he might be a broken shell of his former self. But we're hanging in, trying to make that happen. And we're going to Ghost Army sites such as places like Bettenborg, Battle of Brest, also where they got into a skirmish during the Battle of the Bulge, and all those places, but also places telling the larger World War II story. D-Day beaches, Bletchley Park, Foxholes and Bastogne.
Places where the Canadians were.
We have some fans. The Canadians are buzzing us now overhead. I think on the note of Canadians, I think, Chris, maybe we reached the point where we can stop talking and get on with the show.
Let's do that.
All right, give me a cue.
The bar is open.
The bar is open, Chris. What's on tap?
Well, I guess we've probably hinted at this, but I'm super excited about this show. This week we have Canadian author and historian by the name of Mark Zuehlke, and Mark Zuehlke is probably Canada's foremost authority on the role of Canada into our armed forces in World War II. He's the author of more than a dozen books on the topic, and it's fair to say that I'm a little bit of a fanboy, and I've been able to sneak in most of his books into the collection. I still have a few more to go, but I have most of them, and his Juno Beach trilogy is amongst some of my most well-thumbed books. But this week, we're here to talk about his book, Terrible Victory, the First Canadian Army in the Scheldt Estuary Campaign, September 13 through November 6th, 1944. So welcome, Mark. How are you? Welcome.
I'm well. Thanks for having me, Chris and Rick.
Oh, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
It's Chris's pleasure, and I'm here as well.
Now let's go now.
Do you want me to leave you guys alone?
Yeah. All right. No, so we're going to get it down into the weeds of it, but what we're talking about this week is a campaign that I think is probably safe to say is one of the most important of the Second World War, certainly in Europe, and also one of the most forgotten. So maybe just kind of really brief to start out. What is this campaign, and what are we talking about here as far as time frame?
Well, we're talking basically September 1944 through to early November 1944, so pretty much 2 months. And the issue was that there's Antwerp, which was the largest port. There's the great map, and you can see Antwerp down in the far right-hand corner. And this body of water that runs out eventually to the sea, and you can see an arrow going up to a place called Vlissingen. That's the exit to the sea. You've got 80 kilometers of distance there. Antwerp was, as I said, the largest port in Northwest Europe. The Allies desperately wanted that port and to be able to open it up to shipping, because until now, if they could get Antwerp up to there, everything's still coming across the beaches at Dieppe and being driven by truck up to the ever-advancing line of American and British and Canadian troops. So it's a race to get the supplies there. If they can open up Antwerp, then the shipping comes in there, and the port was in extremely good shape. The Germans hadn't destroyed it a lot. It was taken by British troops on September 4th, if I remember right. And so they had the port, but they didn't have the Scheldt Estuary open. And the British, because of Field Marshal Montgomery, he decides he can do one of two things. He can clear the port and clear the estuary and get the shipping in, or he can proceed with Operation Market Garden. He can do one or the other, but he can't do both. So he decides, of course, to go ahead with Operation Market Garden, as we know, the famous bridge too far, and puts the British resources over into there. The American resources are brought in the form of the paratroop divisions. And he gives the job of clearing the estuary to the Canadians. The problem is we're actually still way down in France, taking the channel ports of Boulogne and Calais and Dunkirk and Dieppe and we're not really ready to get to the estuary. So it's a race for us, for the First Canadian Army, to get up there. And it happens in a very higgledy-piggledy fashion, one division after another arriving to do it. And so by the time the Canadians arrive, the opportunity to easily clear the estuary is lost, because the Germans realize just how important Antwerp is. They've got to keep Antwerp closed. So they're pouring their resources, particularly the 15th German Army that had been retreating from France, into that area to prevent the port from being opened. So that's the basic scenario that we've got.
Right, you've answered my next three questions. But let's dig into the controversy a little bit. You said that the Germans clearly knew, and in your book, I mean, they are frightened. I mean, they are trying to get their troops across that estuary. They're fleeing there. They're trying to hold the defenses there. Montgomery seems almost, I'll exaggerate a little bit just for effect, like blithely oblivious, not oblivious to the need for Antwerp, but about how important it really is. And, and it would be fair to say, Chris and I were talking about this the other day, can't really just blame Montgomery, because there's Eisenhower who's saying Antwerp's really important, but none of these guys, no high commander except maybe the naval commander, Bertram Ramsay, nobody's saying, hey guys, we can't really go on until we get this port. So why are they distracted? Why aren't they giving more resources? Why is it like, oh, Canada, you deal with this?
Yeah, I think it was partly, they were hearing what they wanted to hear. So they're looking at the Germans are falling back. They seem to be in disarray, the 15th Army. Well, it is in disarray. They're trying to get across the estuary. They're desperate to get out of there. When Antwerp falls, the Germans in Holland start to make plans to evacuate the entire country. Like they're basically ready to give it up because they think that the British are just going to immediately come out of Antwerp up into the southern Holland, and they'll be lucky if they can get out of there in one piece. So that's when the British turn away from Antwerp, the Germans can take a breath and start to re-anchor. On the American and British side, yes, we've got a number of key meetings that occur between Montgomery and Eisenhower in late August and early September, where Eisenhower keeps stressing the importance of opening up Antwerp, but at the same time, he's as infatuated with the concept of Operation Market Garden as Bernard Montgomery is. He's looking at Market Garden. They both they recognize it's going to be a calculated gamble. If they go ahead with Market Garden, they're throwing all of their eggs into this basket and they're saying, okay, let's go with it. In the anticipation that if they get to Arnhem and succeed in getting all those bridges and then can push into the Ruhr Valley of Germany, that the old saw comes in, the war will be over by Christmas. And so they take that gamble. And Montgomery writes again and again and again, in his somewhat self-serving memoirs, about having taken this, that he always ends it with, I thought that the Canadians could succeed in clearing the estuary. I was wrong. See, he always kicks the ball back down the road to us.
Yeah.
And there was just no way that we could get there in time. And like the Belgian resistance movements in Antwerp, they had taken the city by the time the British get there. They own roughly half of the port facilities. The other half of the port facilities, though, are north of Antwerp, and they don't control those, and they never do get to control them until quite a bit later in the battle. And they're urging the British, let's go across the bridge into the other port, clear that port area, and then get out there onto the Beveland Estuary or the Beveland Peninsula and get the north side of the Scheldt Estuary, and that they could do it in just a few days. But the British, it was General Brian Horrocks, actually, he's been ordered to stand down by Montgomery, and he follows his orders. And he later admits that it was a big error, that they could have gone and could have done the work. But then Operation Market Garden couldn't happen. So the one or the other.
So Mark, one of the things, again, most of our viewers, or a lot of our viewers, are here in the UK or in the States, and so the perception of the perception of the campaign in Northwest Europe for a lot of people is we land in Normandy, everybody gets ashore, we have a bit of a tussle in Normandy, June, July, beginning of August, there's a big party in Paris, we liberate it, and then we just kind of keep walking east, and then the bulge happens. So obviously, I think that's a popular perception, right? So before the Canadian Army, as it's being brought up to deal with this problem, maybe just for those people who don't know, very briefly, tell us what the Canadians are up to. I mean, there's that whole long left flank advance. They're fighting all the way up.
Yeah, so that's actually a topic of another of my books called The Cinderella
yes,
Campaign. And yes, see, this was once the Americans broke out of the bocage and start going, there's nothing that can stop them. They're out in clear, wide open farm country, basically, just rolling towards Paris. we're going up the coast along the flank. And yeah, there's a great photo of it, map. So up to Le Havre, Dieppe, Dunkirk, all of these different ports there. And this is weird country. You get in here and it's actually, there's quite a lot of low mountains, lots of forest. The river Somme, the river Seine, all these rivers that have to be crossed. And 15th Army, the German army, is retreating to north of us. We're just following them all the time, pushing them on, because they did not go out where the Americans and the British are going. All those lines that the big dark lines are the 1st Canadian Army, and then the lines immediately to the right of them are the British, and then down at the bottom you see 3rd U.S. Army and 1st U.S. Army, and their line of advances. So you got 4 armies. 3 of them are having a pretty easy go, and the 1st Canadian Army is not having an easy go. It's a real hard push through a lot of obstacles, a lot of resistance. And we were our main task at that point is to gain control of those port cities that the Allies are hoping to be able to use for their shipping. Unfortunately, the Germans know that too, and so they're destroying the port facilities in Boulogne and Calais and Le Havre, and it'll be months before they're really back in operation. So the Canadians are facing some really hard fighting along there, and that's why they're too far south when Montgomery says, "Okay, guys, now you got to take over the Antwerp Scheldt Estuary part of the problem."
And they're also in pretty rough shape, right? They've been, it's not, yeah.
The whole fighting in Normandy had left 1st Canadian Army pretty worn out. A lot of casualties, a lot of just a lot of casualties we had suffered. The Polish division that worked with us is pretty much finished by the time they come out of Normandy. They're not they continue to operate, and they manage to get up towards where the Scheldt Estuary is, but that's pretty much the end of what they do in the rest of the war.
So we have a viewer who says, he says he's new to the show. Is it too early to ask questions? No, it's never too early to ask questions. Asks how many Canadian, Polish, and British troops were involved in the Scheldt campaign, and I would add on to that. So yeah, let's give us the order of battle here, not the exact order of battle, but how many on each side? I mean, what's the volume of people, Allied and German, that we're talking about?
Well, you're looking at about 100,000 Canadian, Polish, and British troops being part of 1st Canadian Army. To that eventually gets added a bunch of Royal Marines who were brought in for attacks on Walcheren Island. So that adds another 10,000 roughly. The Germans had pretty similar strength. They weren't hugely depleted. They were spread out across quite a big chunk of geography, and so they tended to form battle groups, and that's the stuff that the Germans were so good at, is throwing together ad hoc units, and that's what they do the moment they get over on the north side of the estuary, is they start taking the units and throwing them together and saying, okay, we need guys over here, we need guys over here. We'll put these under command of Kurt Chill, for example. And
I know, but Camp Group Chill. Yeah, it sounds a little bit, like too laid back, I think.
Oh, yeah.
That's the first thing I thought when I read it.
Yeah, they were one tough unit, because there was a lot of paratroopers in that one, and they were extremely heavily armed. That's the other thing the Germans had going for them in this Scheldt Estuary thing, is they fell back into their line of supply. So they have like an endless amount of ammunition and, Panzerfausts, particularly, Panzerschrecks, MG6, the MG42 machine guns, endless amount of ammunition for them. And we see this as the fighting starts, is that they're able just to set up, because of the flooding and what's called, this whole country is called polders, which are basically little square fields surrounded with a dike going all the way around them, and they tend to be laid out in rectangles or squares. And so the Germans are able to use those defensive positions brilliantly. All they have to do is dig in on the one side of a dike and wait for us to try and get across this flooded land, and they can meet it with artillery mortars and machine gun fire over and over and over again.
And I'm just going to go brief follow up to the question I asked, which is actually Lynn Hargrove's question. Is armor a component on either side, tanks, or is this really because of the way there's so much water and canals and dikes and everything? Is this really primarily infantry?
It's primarily an infantry show. The armor, 4th Canadian Armored Division, was able to operate with some success far over to the right of the estuary. So they were actually right of Antwerp, and we're trying to push up the right flank of 1st Canadian Army. So they're actually not even on the map here. The 2nd Canadian Division is that green line on the far right. 4th Canadian Armored Division is to the right of that. And it's not good tank country, but at least it's not flooded. There are a lot of forests that they're fighting their way through, and woods and areas like that. So they're the only effective tanks, really. What we would do with the other divisions is the tanks would get up onto the roads that are positioned on top of dikes to try and move forward. And all the Germans have to do is knock out the lead tank, and then, because the roads are only wide enough for one tank, they're all single file. So you knock out the tank in the front, knock out the tank at the back, and the rest of them are stuck there, and you can just cherry pick them as you want. So we don't end up using tanks very much, except as artillery sitting back and firing in that regard. So yeah, it's a slog. Really, the one thing about this campaign is it's infantry slogging their way through mud and flooded waters, and trying to get across canals, get across rivers, all in that area. And the Germans are defending both sides. The south side, they create what's called the Breskens Pocket, and they're on that side of the estuary, and they're on the north side. So what we're trying to do is, the Canadians are you can see the pocket is down here on the bottom, and you can see the fighting there. It's all pretty much 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. And then 2nd Canadian Infantry Division over on the right is fighting out from Antwerp to get up to Von Strecht, and then advance out into that South Beveland, Walcheren Island, North Beveland area to get control there. So that's kind of the dimensions. And 4th Canadian Armored Division is to the right off the map, trying to get up to the top of that eastern Scheldt area that you can see in the map as well. They get up there, they'll choke off the ability of the Germans to withdraw from these positions. And so that's kind of the layout of how the whole thing goes.
Okay. So Mark, I know this is going to shock most of our viewers, but there were general officers in the ETO besides Montgomery and Patton. So I know, it's amazing. Perhaps for those folks who don't know, could you talk a little bit about some of the personalities that are leading the Canadian forces, and also talk a bit maybe about one of the other things that is a problem for 1st Canadian Army, which is a lot of the commanders aren't getting along so well.
Yes.
And how that might have impacted the course of events.
Yeah, so 1st Canadian Army is commanded by Lieutenant General Harry Crerar. And under him is 2nd Canadian Corps commander, which is a Lieutenant General Guy Simmons. He's a Canadian. And then we have Crocker, whose first name escapes me right now, who's the first British Corps commander, General Crocker. Yeah, we'll just call him General Crocker. And yes, these are not happy guys. Crerar is a stickler for detail. And he loves detailed plans. When he would generate a plan, it would be hundreds of pages long. He was a micromanager. Simmons had no respect for him. Simmons thinks that Simmons is a lot smarter than Crerar. and so he doesn't have any use for him. Yet he's got the other advantage. Montgomery totally dislikes Crerar. He's been trying from the very beginning, even before the invasion of Normandy, to get rid of Crerar. He's done numerous times, probably about 6-7 different times. He attempts to get Crerar removed from command and to have Simmons become the commander. He views Simmons as a bit of a protege. Simmons himself views Montgomery as his mentor, to the point that he starts to wear a black beret, tanker's beret, the same type as Montgomery
I love it.
Loves to wear. Neither of them are tankers, but what the hell? They'll put on their berets and feel good. So you have that dynamic. Crocker is always on the outs with them all. He doesn't want to be there. First British Corps are basically.
Well, come on, who does?
Yeah, well, they consider themselves. First British Corps kind of see themselves as even more forgotten than the Canadians, because they're over here with First Canadian Army, and the rest of the British Army doesn't even remember that they exist, and they really feel this way. So they feel very left out. They had kind of a rough time in Normandy, and when they come out, they are in pretty bad shape. Because they're over here with the Canadians, they don't have much of a line on being reinforced. That's the last place he's wanting to send reinforcements, is over to them. So it's a tough deal. So there's a lot of ill will between these commanders. And then Crerar, who is under a lot of stress, understandably, he develops jaundice and is replaced temporarily because he's sick. So he's sent back to England to recover. And so the Scheldt Estuary battle is Guy Simmons's chance. He's now in command, and boy, is he ready to take that role. So he takes over control of the operation. Now you'll notice on the map that Rick put up that First British Corps isn't there.
This map?
Yeah. So the British are in such bad shape that they're basically sent over again off the map to the right to just provide a linkage between 1st Canadian Army and the 2nd British Army, who's much further off the map, engaged in Operation Market Garden.
I've thrown up a different map, which has got a lot more arrows on it. So it's now that people understand the territory a little bit, maybe it won't be like, what am I looking at?
Yeah, because it's a bit of a mess, I know, because it's showing all the brigade.
And there's
movements.
The 1st British Corps all the way over on the right.
That's right. So they're over there. Again, their job is to try and get up to Moerdijk, which you can see on the top right-hand corner via Roosendaal. And again, that's part of a blocking movement to trap the Germans that are in the Scheldt campaign area, where all the many, 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 many arrows are, and hold them in there. So that's what their job is to do, and it's pretty slow going for them because they don't have a lot of strength. And 4th Canadian Armored Division, you can now see to the left of the 1st British Corps, is going up through Essen and those kind of places, and to Bergen op Zoom, which is a major community in that area of the South Holland area. So that's kind of the layout, and you could also actually see the poles there briefly.
We'll put it back. We want to see the poles.
Back. So the poles are down there. They're going up
first Polish armored
through Hulst-Kielkijuit, which I can never pronounce, to Terneuzen, which is a small port town that they managed to take on September the 20th. That becomes important for what then is operation into the Breskens pocket that we call Operation Switchback. And because that can be the launching place for a small amphibious invasion that we pull off.
Well, I was going to say, well, first of all, I want to just remind people that we're talking today to historian Mark Zuehlke, who is the author of Terrible Victory, First Canadian Army and the Scheldt Estuary Campaign, September to November 1944. And I got to say, I never quite know with this campaign whether the most complicated thing is the geography or whether it's saying the names of the towns. So
I know
they're both complicated.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fighting, and the famous Canadian Black Watch Division is involved in some fighting that I'm sure will come up before the end of the hour in a terrible day known as Black Friday. But you just mentioned, there's an amphibious component to this, and I think in a broader way, water plays a big role in this campaign. Because there's an amphibious component because so many of these places are islands or causeways. And then we make the decision, we being the Allies, make the decision that we're going to bomb the dikes that hold back the water. There's another map here, and I apologize to the podcast listeners who are now screaming in frustration that they can't see the maps. We'll find a place to post them that they can see them. But it's a little bit complicated when you look at this map. But what you will see is that all of the kind of the sea is green, and then the more olive color, that's all land below sea level. So that when we decide to bomb the dikes and flood things, it becomes, especially there on Walcheren Island, it becomes a big factor. And then you also see some of the various, in this map, some of the various amphibious portions of this. So I guess talk about water.
Yeah.
In its various forms here.
Yeah, well, it's, where this part of Holland and even Belgium is all reclaimed polder. What they've done is the Dutch have drained the seawater away and by building dikes and then basically pumping the salt water away and creating farmland. And the Dutch have a saying for this part of Holland is that God created the world and the Dutch created Zealand. and it's something like that. I think I got the saying slightly wrong, but anyway. But yes, so Walcheren Island, that big one that we saw, the Simmons is again a major lead on this. The Germans have, this island is incredibly heavily fortified. If they have gun positions all along the coast, facing out to the sea and also into the Scheldt Estuary. And getting control of Walcheren Island is going to be extremely hard fought and costly. The Allies know this. They've been doing some studying on this. And so Simmons, with the authorization ultimately from Eisenhower, because it's a big decision, they decide that what they're going to do is have the RAF and the U.S. Air Force bomb the dikes and breach them and flood the island. And that's exactly what happens. You can see the flooding there. This has the effect of isolating the Germans who are in their positions. They are now cut off from each other, basically almost unable to move from one position to another. So it really compromises their ability to defend Walcheren Island. It comes at a cost. A lot of they before they did the bombing, they dropped leaflets all over the island,
Always effective.
telling the Dutch to leave. It was a great idea if the Dutch had anywhere to go, which they don't. A good number, about half of the population does go to Middelburg, which is a city in the middle of Walcheren Island that is above sea level, and they take refuge there. But in many places like Vlissingen, for example, which is on the coast, that town gets flooded. And I was able to get a story of one woman who was in one of the, they'd taken shelter in one of the windmills on the coast. And she's the only person that gets out. There's about 100 Dutch in there. And she's the only one that gets out alive. The rest drowned.
She listens to their voices disappear one by one.
Yeah. So, that kind of, the strangest thing about this is when you go to Walcheren Island, they aren't bitter. I went there. I was thinking, man, I'm going out there to interview these Dutch who were survivors, and I was expecting a kind of frosty greeting from them, but they were very much the other way. They generally recognized that it was a needed thing to happen, and for the battle to be won. I interviewed one fellow, and he was I think he was 12 years old or something like that. His father was the mayor of Vlissingen, and so the Germans they had taken over their house and turned it into a staff headquarters. And as the waters were rising, one German asked the young boy, he said, "How high is the water going to go?" And the young boy said, "You see the top of that roof there? It's going to get up to there eventually," which it wasn't going to do. But he's putting the fear of God into these guys, because most of the Germans there were not coastal people. They came from Bavaria, I believe it was, and so they didn't know anything about the sea, and but they were cut off, and they couldn't fight effectively. So that enabled the attacks on Walcheren, when they occur towards the end of the campaign, to be able to be done by amphibious forces landing on the North Sea side. And there's a photo of this is Marine commandos going in to attack there. Vlissingen is just over to the left of there. And then the Canadians, we advance up what's called the Walcheren Causeway that comes off of Beveland and into Walcheren. And that's a huge battle, and somewhat the subject of a kind of odd Dutch recently made movie called The Forgotten Battle in English.
This is a painting, I think, you sent us of the battle.
That's right. This is a painting of the Calgary Highlanders advancing along the Walcheren Causeway. And that causeway is completely changed now. It's much, much, much wider. You can't get the same image of it. But the Germans, you can see in that painting, they've created fighting positions, dugouts all along there. It's a killing ground.
And Mark, as you're talking about that, we have Norma Graham, who's clearly a big fan because she's read a lot of your books and is commenting a lot here. Says, please mention Ross Ellis if possible. He's involved in the fighting here on the causeway, I think.
Yes, he's the commander of the Calgary Highlanders, and he did not want to do this attack. But when they were given it, he leads it very well. They do get to the end of the causeway in a crazy advance. where they're basically just running down the road and get to the end of the causeway despite heavy fire from the Germans. The Germans are actually firing 88 millimeter rounds straight down the causeway. At one point, the rounds are hitting the ground and pinwheeling because they're armor piercing. So they're just going right over the heads of the Calgary Highlanders. So they get to the end of the causeway, but they can't hold. They eventually have to break and withdraw. And Ross Ellis remains a huge hero figure within the Calgary Highlanders. They actually have a memorial lecture in his honor every year.
So Mark, since it's so important, you talk about this quite a bit in the book. The veterans talk about this. I know veterans that I had a chance to meet in years gone by they would talk about the conditions. So can you, I mean, as best as you can in words, describe what the conditions were like during this campaign? What are these guys fighting in?
Well, the conditions are the worst, I think, that Western Allied troops faced in World War II, really. Because of the flooding, it's constantly wet. Everything and should also mention the weather from that part of late September through to November. The weather in Europe we're moving into what's going to be the worst winter in 50 years in Europe. So it starts to rain, and this is a problem for Montgomery and his Operation Market Garden, because one of the things he was hoping not to have to deal with was rain. So there's really heavy rain. So the soldiers, their uniforms are soaking wet all the time. And there's the mud, and it's cold. And that's the kind of conditions they're fighting in. Normally, when you have an army, like 1st Canadian Army fighting, you would have one of your divisions at least in reserve, so it could take over and the other guys could come out and recoup, bring in reserves, clean themselves up, and then be sent back to replace that division. Because of the sheer width of ground that we're fighting in the Scheldt Estuary thing, that's not possible. Instead, all 3 infantry, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, 4th Canadian Armored Division, are all fighting simultaneously across this big landscape. There's no time for anyone to get out of the battle. And even at the divisional level, because of the width of the battlefield, pretty much all of the brigades are committed all the time. So you have no reserves. And that is just not the way an operation should go. Campaigns are always built around the idea that you hold back a third of your army as a reserve and then can bring them forward. That's the model. No way is that happening here. Everybody is, you've basically got everything in and including the kitchen sink thrown in. So it's very bad. The other thing is, because of all the rain and everything, there's very limited air support available. The Typhoons and Spitfires that are fighter bombers that have supported Allied troops very well in the Normandy campaign can't fly. They're not there. And so that support's not there. So it's really artillery fire that's the main support. But what happens when an artillery shell hits a big pool of water? It just goes down and gets buried in the mud and blows up, throws up some water. So artillery fire is not effective overall. And so again, it comes down to this infantry slog, where it's mortars and Bren guns are what we have as supporting arms.
Chris, can I ask a question about the Black Watch, or do you have that? Do you want to do that?
Well, no, I mean, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that people who watch our show faithfully, which I know is some of the audience there, uh, you're all faithful to some degree, may recall that we did a show with historian David O'Keefe about the fight at Verrières Ridge in Normandy, and the Royal Highland Regiment, the Black Watch, suffers terrible losses. They go 300 people from battalion go up Verrières Ridge, and 15 come back. The rest are casualties or prisoners. So then they have another terrible day on October 13th, 1944, here in the Scheldt Estuary, when they're ordered to take a town which the Germans had fully fortified, and it doesn't go well. So can you tell us about that a little bit, and maybe that in a way can be sort of emblematic of some of the just the degree of difficulty that troops are facing in this battle.
It does work as a good one. So the Black Watch had been reconstituted after Verrières Ridge. A lot of new people brought in to bring it up to strength. October 13th, they're trying to cut off the entrance to South Beveland. It's a little narrow, it's quite narrow piece of ground, and they're trying to choke it off. There's a railroad station and a dike. And so it's a raised railway bed that goes into South Beveland, coming from a town called Vonstrecht into South Beveland. And they're on this dike. So the Germans are dug in heavily on the opposite side of the railway line from where the Black Watch are. Between the Black Watch start line for the attack is a very large, somewhat flooded field that I think it's a beet farm, sugar beets, and it's wide open. There's no cover, nothing to give them any kind of protection. And the Black Watch are ordered to cross this farm field, get to the railroad, and get the Germans off of there and gain control of the entrance to the South Beveland, and then lead that advance, which will lead over to the causeway. The attack ends up going in broad daylight. There's 1,200 yards of open ground to cover, so pretty close to a mile, eh? And they go out there and they start advancing, and the Black Watch had a tendency to always do their, they tended to attack in a World War I kind of style. In some ways, they were their own worst enemies, because they don't do try anything very tactical. They just line up and go like a World War I assault out into no man's land and start moving forward. Their support is artillery fire, and as we've said earlier, the artillery shells land in the water. They're not that effective. Same with the mortars. And so they just are moving across this open ground, and the Germans are sitting over there with their MG-42s and their mortars, and they just rip them apart. The Black Watch suffered 145 casualties in really what was just a matter of minutes. And of those 145 casualties, 56 die out there in the fields. So it's, once again, the Black Watch are chewed up, not as badly as at Verrières Ridge, but, basically 25% casualty rate suffered. And it comes to other units coming in from the other side to clear that railway bed coming out of Vonstrecht, rather than that attempt to come straight up from the south. So Yeah, it's always it's known as Black Friday in the Black Watch regimental history records, and it really was.
Yeah. Well, no. So, Mark, kind of picking up on that, there's a question here from one of our guests that kind of ties into this, because it's not just the Black Watch that has black days. I mean, there's you talk about the Algonquins, and another instance. There are several instances where there are just regiments that are just shredded. And so the question is from Francois Pinel. He says, was First Canadian Army well utilized, well commanded, and do you think that they were effective in the field? I mean, was there an easier way to do this?
There really wasn't an easier way of doing it at this point. Had we not had to, had that decision to clear the Scheldt Estuary been made in early September, and Montgomery acted on that, they wouldn't have had to been this almost foot by foot battle for it, because that's what the Germans effectively set up. They set up defensive positions that had to be removed one after the other, and because we couldn't bring armor to bear, you couldn't really bring a lot of effective artillery to bear. The only way you can do it is infantrymen going forward and doing it in a slog. I think the command was about as good as it could be in those kind of situations. It becomes really a battalion commander's battle, with some, like, where we do things that are innovative, and they work. Operation Switchback, where we moved 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade of 3rd Division from Terneuzen to a place called Hoofdblad on the Breskens pocket area. That was brilliantly executed. The Germans are caught entirely by surprise. We gain control of that area, and it starts the process of the Breskens pocket being collapsed. But there's not a lot of opportunity for that kind of innovative way of going about things.
Could airborne have helped here if we had dropped here instead of Nijmegen, Arnhem?
Yeah, there was actually a plan to use airborne troops to drop them onto Walcheren. It's a really good question. And those troops were withdrawn at the last minute in the planning, and it's a big question, because had you not flooded Walcheren but dropped airborne troops on it, could they have won the island? And once you gain control of Walcheren Island, the Breskens pocket's no longer that important. The Beveland Peninsula is not that important. Would the Germans have pulled as much as they could out of there and it retreated?
But the guy who shoots down that idea is Brereton, who in September, 9th Air Force Commander, he's the guy in September who tells Montgomery and all the planets from Market Garden, "Oh, we can't have those drop zones right next to the objective. I might lose some planes. So let's just land 8 miles away." So when I read that, and he says the same thing at Walcheren, what amazed me is that anybody's listening to him at all at this point. But
there you are. He's got a lot of sway, and
because of the great job he did in the Philippines, maybe.
Exactly. Right, yeah.
And like you constantly see Bertram Ramsay. You could almost imagine him in every meeting just shaking his head and putting his arms up, and because everything Bertram Ramsay predicts is going to happen happens, and nobody's listening to him. It's just it must have been his levels of frustration must have been huge, because he sees how impossible it is to open up the port unless all this happens, all this fighting. And eventually, of course, we do win. We do open up the port.
And of course, the Canadians receive due credit for doing that, right?
Yeah, right. We weren't invited to the party. the only presence, our only presence in Antwerp when the first ships come in is actually the first freighter is a Canadian freighter that arrives. And
no victory parade, huh?
No. One artillery officer, George Blackburn, drove into Antwerp that day and bought a couple caseloads of whiskey to take back to the troop, to his unit. And so he saw the victory parade, but from a distance, and then he drove back to the front lines.
Wow. Chris, you got one more in the barrel?
Well, yeah, I just, Mark, since I'm kind of throwing a softball up in the air here, but as you're doing all your research, I know Rick and I spend a lot of our times traveling, going to the spots where things happen. I know you've led tours to various battlefields, just because it certainly helps all of us. Maybe you could talk about how important it is to actually go to the places that you're writing about, to see the ground, and what impact that has on the work you do.
Oh, it's huge. Like the Scheldt Estuary battlefield, I actually really like visiting that one, and we're actually going to be taking a tour in there in September, called the Cinderella Army Tour, and we're going to follow the Canadians all the way from Normandy up to Holland, but
Chris, you may have to quit your job.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to
take this tour.
I'll trade you a band of brothers for Cinderella Army.
Yeah. So it's that battlefield particularly, you really appreciate the difficulty of the polder country when you're actually standing at the Leopold Canal, for example, or at that field where the Black Watch were shredded. It's when you stand on the Walcheren Causeway, which is 4 times as wide as it was in World War II, you can still see what it would have been like. And then you see the batteries on Walcheren Island. There's dozens and dozens of German bunkers still there. You can really get a sense of that battlefield. As you know, as well as historians, you got to visit these battlefields to be able to write about them effectively. And you can tell when somebody's writing about it who hasn't ever seen it. It just, there's things. Even when the battlefields don't look like what they did then, you can still reimagine them.
Or sometimes you get 2 historians with 2 compasses that don't point in the same direction. That can never happen to us, right, Chris?
There's a magnetic force field in certain parts of Quebec.
I think there was they had some kind of lab with a super magnet nearby, but that was in Quebec. So, Mark Zuehlke, thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to thank everybody who watched as well. We had a lot of great comments in the comment pane. We couldn't get to everybody. Great comments and questions from a very engaged audience. Mark Zuehlke is, as Chris, whoever my co-host is, as Chris mentioned, Mark is the author of an entire series about the Canadian Army in World War II. But this book, Terrible Victory, First Canadian Army in the Scheldt Estuary Campaign. But as Mark's got many books, you should check them out, and they are very good and very popular, as they should be.
Let us know if you'd like to have Mark back to talk.
Yes, give us a shout right now. Leave us a comment if you want us to bring Mark back, because we would love. Mark, if you come on the show 5 times, you do get a hat. So no one's quite gotten there yet, but we have some front runners. You could compete in that.
Okay, I want the hat.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Mark.
Okay.
That was good.
That was awesome to bring back the show on the Scheldt Estuary, and a fantastic guest, one of Canada's Canada's greatest World War II historians. And next week, I will be back home. Will you be back home? You're not sure.
I'm not sure.
We're so many weeks into the future.
I don't even
it's
know.
Really hard to know. But we'll be talking to retired U.S. Army Colonel Edna Cummings about the 6888. What was the 6888?
It was a
postal unit made up of incredibly resourceful and persistent and courageous African American women.
Yeah, and they were recently awarded a Congressional Gold Medal,
Which you know something about.
as was the Ghost Army. Separate votes.
I gave that in there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no.
And Edna was deeply involved in that. And she also led the Stephen Ambrose Tour's 6888 tour, 6888. So come join us next week to learn more about these amazing women, one of whom is buried in the cemetery at Omaha Beach. Two of whom. Oh, I stand corrected.
See, now you should go on the tour. So
I think
or you'll
now,
ask Edna about this. We'll get this clarified.
Well, now I'll go back in time to when I was visiting Omaha Beach, which is actually next week as we're recording, and I'll get it correct. How's that? Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thank you very much. Be safe, everybody.